Delegates, it's now my honor and pleasure to introduce to us the next panel that is sponsored by the Visual Communication Studies Division of the International Communication Association. The moderator for this session is Dr. Kyser Lough from the University of Georgia in the United States of America. Kyser, please take the microphone and introduce to us the panel. Just to let you know, Kyser, that we have an audience online and we also have an audience in the auditorium here in Nairobi, Daystar University. It has been very good 2 last days. Tomorrow is our 3rd day. We are praying and hoping that our next annual scientific conference on research ethics and research process next year, that we shall have you as a panel physically in Nairobi, not just online. But we are happy and we appreciate the smile. And now I hand over the microphone to you. Welcome. Let us appreciate the team from the US that have woken up so early to do their presentation to us. Thank you. Kyser, please.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening. My name is Dr. Kyser Lough from the University of Georgia here in the United States. I'm the Secretary of the Visual Communication Studies Division at the International Communication Association, and I am so excited to be here virtually with you today to introduce to you our fabulous panelists and to moderate the conversation that we will have concerning visual ethics and research. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today. Dr. Patricia Aufderheide is a professor of communication studies in the School of Communication at American University in Washington, D.C., United States. She researches ethics in documentary film, as well as copyright and creative communities. For both of these topics, she has worked closely with her university's Institutional Review Board. She also founded the school's Center for Media and Social Impact, where she continues as a senior research fellow. Her books include Reclaiming Fair Use, How to Put Balance Back in Copyright, Documentary, A Very Short Introduction, The Daily Planet, and Communications Policy in the Public Interest. She has been a Fulbright Research Fellow twice in Brazil and Australia. She's also a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow and has served as a juror at the Sundance Film Festival, among others. Dr. Aufderheide has received numerous journalism and scholarly awards, including the George Stoney Award for Service to Documentary from the University Film and Video Association, a Career Achievement Award from the International Digital Media and Arts Association, as well as the Scholarship and Preservation Award from the International Documentary Association. Today, Dr. Aufderheide will present When Do Visual Arts Researchers Need IRBs? She will share her experience with university institutional review boards when dealing with human subjects in visual arts research, and will present research conducted in conjunction with filmmakers to establish a code of ethics in documentary filmmaking. I'm very excited to present to you Dr. Aufderheide.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here with you and to be talking about this important topic. I hope you can see my slides. Just real quick to refresh, institutional ethics boards or institutional review boards, they can be called other things. They are federally mandated in the United States, and they are also national law in Kenya. In the United States, any university, any institution that gets any money from the federal government has to have one. The most important thing I can tell you about institutional review boards in the United States, and unfortunately I can only speak from the US perspective, is that they are not a general ethics board. They ask very limited questions. They are institutionally based, and their committees are made up of scientists and professors. That is a different situation in Kenya. I assume that you, since you are co-sponsoring this with NACOSTI, you have that knowledge that I have only a very limited knowledge of. I spoke of the limited mandate of the IRBs in the US. Our acronym for them is generally IRBs, because it's very important to make a determination if you're doing visual studies, whether this really applies to you. First of all, this is only about research that you're doing directly with actual human beings. And it has to be a systematic investigation. That means there has to be some consistent method you're using that if somebody else followed your method, they could hope to obtain the same results, or if they got different results, it would be important. Universities can add their own requirements. Ours have some. I'm happy to share these slides with you. But the basic principles are the same ones that exist in Kenya: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So how serious does anybody really take this? Well, at one level, it's taken very seriously. It's absolutely essential for any federally grant-funded process. And also, if you're going to get grants from anyone else, they probably want to see that. Research universities insist upon this process. They warn you that if you don't do it, you're in trouble, because they don't want to put their federal funding at risk. They do not want any kind of fines or court cases. The reality is actually somewhat different. You could start a project without approval and nobody would know until you published a paper. And increasingly, journals will say, did your institutional review board approve it? But it's also possible to get a paper published somewhere that doesn't ask that question. Also, something that does happen, and that we certainly caution people against in our graduate programs, is you could switch methods. It happens all the time in a research project. Your research requires some tweaks. You're going to change your method and you don't go back to the IRB. The IRB approved a different thing than you're now doing. The IRB wouldn't know that either. It's kind of on the honor system. I don't know what really happens in Kenya, but this is much more true in the social sciences than in the medical sciences and in engineering. The whole IRB system was set up because of terrible things that happened medically. So the necessity for an institutional review board reflects the concerns that came out during the Nuremberg trials about what Nazis had done to their Jewish subjects in hospitals, how they used them as a kind of a guinea pig. It also reflected the scandal of the Tuskegee experiments in the US, where Black men were not told that they had syphilis in order to have a control group for treating syphilis. This is a crime against humanity. The government also did radiation experiments on soldiers and civilians, and also did other kinds of experiments, and Wikipedia is here to tell you the details, but our government did do terrible things to both military and civilians in the name of medical knowledge. The response to that ultimately was fairly recent in 1974 to create these things. So the emphasis started out, and still primarily is, in a medical context. However, it has extended to the social sciences and to any kind of scientific inquiry that applies to people, working directly with people, and is systematic. So what does this mean for visual studies? Well, often it means that you do not have to get an IRB. If you are only doing a textual analysis of comparing 3 movies, no, that's not an IRB. Somebody else could come up with a completely different analysis. Supposing you're using publicly available data, like you're doing an analysis of changes in the industry that reflect changes in theatrical distribution with streaming. Well, that's publicly available data. Anyone can use it. You might have other ethical questions that you want to bring to your study, but the IRB would not apply. Also, supposing you're dealing with human beings and you're interviewing them, but you're interviewing them in a journalistic way. You're finding things out, but you're not applying a consistent protocol or method to your study. I have done a lot of journalistic reporting. Journalistic reporting is not replicable. And it doesn't apply a consistent scientific method, although we journalists also, when I'm a journalist, I also apply other ethical standards like accuracy and fairness and so on. But from an IRB perspective, you don't have to get an IRB for any of those things. So sometimes you could be a visual studies scholar and want, or put it this way, need to apply for an IRB. And please don't take the fact that I said that this was an honor system and that you can get away with things to imply that in any way I think that's a good idea. And I do think I'm a strong proponent of people in social sciences and where it applies visual studies using their IRB and working with them. And I'm going to tell you why. But here are some examples of when you could and should apply. You are doing interviews with people, but you're using a consistent protocol. And by protocol, I mean a set of questions that you are asking everybody. That protocol might be a little loose. It might be that you only have 3 general questions, and depending on the kind of person you're talking to, it would be different, but you would still be trying to systematically find something out by asking people a consistent thing. Another example is experiments. There are actually a lot of experiments in visual studies. For instance, how a lot of people who explore the question of narrative transportation, how people get caught up in a story and lose their sense of themselves in the middle of the story by identifying with characters and following the emotional thread of the story. Well, you might be studying that in a variety of ways. One of them by presenting different images or clips to people and finding out their reactions. There are lots of different kinds of experiments using visual features. A lot of experiments are being done right now to ask what kind of responses do people have to 3-dimensional AR or VR, virtual reality, augmented reality, storytelling versus broadcast or print. And so people are doing comparative studies of that. So these are examples where you would be going to the IRB. And the IRB would have one central question. They want to know, how is that study going to affect your subject? What risk are you putting that person you are interacting with to? That's their only question. Again, I'm speaking from a US perspective. So when you think, do I need to go to the IRB on this? What we would be asking is, am I gathering data directly from people? What kinds of harm could come to them because I'm asking them this question? That is not necessarily, that's something you really sometimes need to think about. For instance, what if you promise them that their names won't be used, but you're not storing your data in a safe place? What if your data is stored in a safe place, but it's accessible by entities that you have a reason to believe might want to harm them? For instance, a hostile government or people involved in a lawsuit that is unrelated to them, but to which their data applies. What if somebody found out what they said and they're working, as many people in the visual media industry are, supposing they're working in a small, network in which reputation is the currency of your legitimacy. And you said something that could be regarded as not industry practice or personally reflecting poorly on you. What could happen to them if you ask them about something and it re-traumatizes them? It creates a PTSD because it reminds them of something horrible. Any of those things are very possible from interviews you might do with them or experiments you might do with them, and you might not have a way to even know in advance if that was going to be true. So the remedies that people think about when they think about IRBs in relationship to this one problem of making sure that your subjects are not harmed by what you do. Some of the remedies are obviously making sure that you have good control over your data, that you have a systematic way of collecting your data so that you can do what you promised them. Probably the single most important thing that people do is get informed consent, truly informed consent. And truly informed consent would mean giving them a way, not simply a form of some kind, but a way for them to understand what you're really asking of them and warning them about the things you already thought about that might harm them by participating with you in this. Some people don't want to do that because they're like, who's going to talk to me after I tell them all the scary things that could happen? But it's actually, I'll tell you my experience, it's actually, I think, very, very important. Obviously, having something written is good for your IRB because it shows you that them, if they would ever ask, which in my experience, they never have, but it would have some documentation of what you did. But often giving people a written document is not the best way to communicate this. You might want to talk to them personally, and you might want to let them talk to you about things that they might be worried about. So in other words, taking this charge to do them no harm seriously, thinking about it in a very 360 way, all the way through your data collection and storage and release process, and then sharing with them all the things you thought about is a sincere way to actually take your IRB seriously. And so this has worked out extremely well for me. I'll give you I'll give you examples from two kinds of studies I've done. I've done several in both categories. One is, how do people understand their copyright rights and how does that affect their creative behavior? Now that, if I'm going to talk to people about that, that means I'm talking to them about things that they might worry are illegal. They might or might not be illegal, but maybe they think they're illegal. Maybe they're not industry practice. Maybe they want to say something about the behavior of a company that they were working in or with that is relevant to your study, but might not be the nicest thing to say about that company. All of these things could put them at risk if they were found out. The same kinds of problems occur in the other kinds of studies I've done, which are what kinds of ethical problems do people experience in documentary filmmaking? Whenever people have an ethical problem, that's something that they either solved to their mind well or poorly. Many times they wish that they'd solved it better. But if we're really going to understand what they are, we have to warn people that talking about this involves those reputational problems and exposure problems. The methods we used in both cases were interviews that had a consistent protocol, but a lot of error in them as well. So we wrote informed consent forms and talked to them about the fact that we are aware of how tiny their world is, how networked it is, how important reputational damage is. We did this because if we didn't do this, the risk to our study was just as big as the other side of it was to the subject. We could not do these things if we did not have the confidence of the people we talked to that we would not be doing them harm. Otherwise, they were just going to lie to us or not tell us what they really happened to them. This worked extremely well. First of all, we have an IRB. I'm at a university that does not have a medical school, and it has a rather small biological sciences division, which means that most of what they do is social science. And unlike a lot of big research universities, they are familiar with social science. We have always received waivers for our studies. In other words, they said you actually don't need to apply for an IRB. In spite of the fact that they gave us a waiver, we chose nonetheless to solicit informed consent in a very serious way. We always used secure data storage. We did something else that I do not recommend everybody do all the time. In this case, it was the right thing to do. We have deleted the original data after publication of results. And this is a case-by-case choice. We did it for a very specific reason. The data that we released was widely interesting to the entire industry. There are many lawsuits or many threatened lawsuits throughout this industry on related issues. And we have since we started these studies and deleted the data every time, we have been approached by people involved in lawsuits not remotely related to our studies, who said, your data will be relevant to our study, and under US law, we have the right to discovery of your original data. And we were able to say to them, really sorry, sir, it has all been deleted. Now that contravenes a lot of basic social science practice. We generally try to keep our data open for people, but given the kinds of things we were investigating, that was inappropriate. I've given you two images of two of the places where we put these results, a study called Honest Truths, which is about documentary filmmakers' ethics problems, and a book called Reclaiming Fair Use. I would just want to signal again that there are many other ethical considerations, and there is a big discussion, particularly in documentary filmmaking right now in the United States, that I think will echo back to visual studies about the need to have a really deep ethical practice in your study. And people are drawing from the standards. pbs.org/standards is a site that just launched this week that for the first time makes utterly transparent the logic of why PBS, our public broadcasting system, has such a rigorous set of ethical standards. It's really worth looking at. Another issue is that people are drawing from all the good work of human rights organizations about how to deal with human rights victims, including victims of gender-based violence. I've given you a couple of links here. One of them is to a code of best practices in dealing with human rights victims. Those concerns are great concerns to apply for anyone, including like care, make sure they're comfortable, make sure they're safe, make sure they're treated respectfully. Probably the biggest question I think is important in ethics is, why are you doing this study? Are you adding value? Are you making anything? Are you trying to make anything better here? Will anything happen because you did this, or are you just going to bother people? And obviously there are situation specific cases. Anyway, I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. And here's my contact information. And I'm delighted to share with the organizers my slides if that would be at all helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aufderheide. That was very enlightening, very informative. As someone who's gone through the IRB process several times, I'm always learning something new. We now have some time for questions. So I understand there's somebody in the audience that can handle audience questions. I will monitor the chat box here. If you're participating virtually and you'd like to type your question in to the chat box, I will gladly read it out. But let's start with anybody who is in attendance in person if there are questions. Well, while we get that all set up, I have 1,000. So let me kick that off. Dr. Aufderheide, I think, we have one. Okay, let's go.
So we're asking for questions from people present here physically in Nairobi. Any question, any comment to the presentation? Patricia, I have one. I saw you mentioned, maybe I didn't get it clearly, but you mentioned that one of the options when it comes to, apart from receiving,
Whoops.
You delete after the collection of data. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Maybe I didn't get it properly.
So we chose to delete the original data.
You are muted.
I am not muted myself, so there is some problem on the other end. Can people hear me now?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. We chose to delete the data because if we didn't, we could not be comfortable with the level of anonymization we had done with the original data. The stories that people had told us were too specific. We actually went back to every one of our informants when before we published the report with the draft report, and they frequently told us, you mentioned that you mentioned a particular kind of fish that was involved in this nature documentary, and there are only X number of documentaries on that fish. So could you just say fish? We had problems with specificity, and we felt that no matter what we did with that data, it would remain vulnerable. So we decided to delete it and make it unavailable to anyone after we had published the results. That has other consequences. It means that we cannot continue to draw on that data. We can't share those stories with other people, but those stories put people at risk too much to be able to be made available to anyone, even accidentally. That is not the case with much research. So I do not say that this is a universal thing. I think this is a case where if you apply those basic principles of safety, care, respect, in the service of your own research, in the service of getting what you need, we were getting stories that the industry never makes public. And we wanted people to know the consequences, the ethical consequences and the creative consequences of that behavior. But doing that meant that we had to take unusual steps to keep information safe.
Thank you, Patricia, for that response. Anyone else from the audience in Nairobi? Yes, we are having an official from NACOSTI. You did mention NACOSTI in your presentation. He's the acting director for quality assurance and accreditation. Yeah, Patricia is happy. So he's called Mr. Wanyama. You have the platform.
Thank you, Chair. First is to congratulate the panelists from the US. I think you've done a very good job. Patricia, I've listened to your presentation with a lot of interest, and particularly when it comes to issues of undertaking interviews. I think one of the things that I want to just share from the Kenyan experience is that perhaps Kenya, unlike the US, I think issues of consent or informed consent sometimes are not straightforward within certain communities. And that is why within our IREX, we usually insist that there has to be a representative from the local community, mostly in the sense that the person is a lay person, in the sense that he's representing the interests of the community, that he lives within the community, he understands how the community behavior and patterns, so that he can be able to bring in that value when it comes to review of protocols. I would want to tell you that there are certain places in this country where if you want to interview, say, a lady, they may say, no, the husband must be available, or the brother, or, a man has to be available, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the things that perhaps bring a difference between the kind of IREX that you may be having within the US as compared to the kind of IREX that we have here in Kenya. And again, just to emphasize that perhaps the level of what I call it integrity could be a little bit higher than here, because sometimes, unless if you allow people to declare whether this research doesn't require IRB clearance or not, most often than not, many people would say that it doesn't, simply because they want to make it easier for themselves to be able to proceed. Perhaps in developed countries, I think people may be a little bit honest. But here, maybe because of many other reasons, people would want to take a shortcut. And therefore, the emphasis that all research has to go go through a whole process of review. Otherwise, I want to thank you again for that very presentations and say that they've been quite informative from our part, and I think there's quite a lot that we can be able to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Aufderheide, I see you commented a little bit. You want to elaborate?
I'm not sure that U.S. researchers are any much less in love with a shortcut than Kenyan researchers. I think this is one of the reasons why there's so much IRB training and so much institutional emphasis on it. And I only mentioned that there isn't always the check back that one might think, because I think it just emphasizes how important it is to get it right at the beginning, because you can besmirch your own research and your own record if you're not taking those steps. And I guess the big takeaway I wanted to make sure people understood was that to us, having IRB process made our research much more successful. It worked, and people did not get in our way. Yes, there's forms. Yes, it's irritating to go through bureaucracy, but it was genuinely worth it to have other eyes on our process so we could double check ourselves and really think about it.
Absolutely. I see we have another question at the podium.
Informative. Now, I have a question of curiosity. Yesterday, we had a lot of discussion about the dominance in terms of North and South dimension in terms of research, but more so the question of ethics dumping, where you find that countries in the West see weak regulatory frameworks in the countries in the so-called South. And so they would prefer to do research here. And of course, we know in these areas, in these sites of ours, the data is still there and there's a lot of interesting things to research. But then the curiosity, my question is just to pick your brain. What would be your take? What is your opinion when it comes to that flouting of ethics because of the different dimensions of power, dynamics, and dominance in research? Thank you.
Kyser, I don't know what the discussion yesterday was about. And so I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think, and someone there can correct me if I misunderstood the idea of U.S. scholars heading to other countries where there's a perception that you can breach ethics a little bit easier than kind of having the oversight from the US, and so seeing it as a place where you can go to sort of blur the lines a little bit more, because it's not as, I guess, rigorously looked at as it is in the US. But at least from my experience, I know anytime I've done international research that I've gone through the IRB, they've been just as stringent on making sure that we're doing everything properly.
What you're what the speaker was describing sounds appalling to me. It sounds it adds a layer of colonialism on top of the original ethical breach. So I'm appalled by that if it happens. And I'm sure you're speaking from experience. I don't have that experience. I have only worked with scholars from Korea and with scholars from Australia. And in both cases, we had to have a mutual IRB and a memorandum of understanding that was looked at from both sides. And in the case of Australia, delayed the process by 6 months. So I don't have that experience, but I would like to condemn any such behavior.
Absolutely. Patricia, do you feel like, I think sometimes we see the IRB as, as kind of just another hurdle we have to cross to kind of dot our I's and and cross our T's. When, as you've explained, a lot of this comes down to pure human ethics and being a good person, and realizing that the people that we're interacting with for our research are human beings and not subjects. Do you find that the IRB, let me rephrase that. a lot of what you talked about was the protection of the data and the protection of your participants after the fact. But the way I see the IRB is also protecting our participants during the course of interviews. So had you have any experience with IRBs on coming back on the way you're asking questions or the certain things that you're presenting to your participants to make sure that they're kept safe during the actual interview process?
That is a great question. And I served on the IRB as well. And so I've seen what the IRB in our case was most useful for was in looking over our protocol, asking questions that weren't clear to them, because if that protocol was not clear to them, it certainly wasn't going to be clear to anyone else. But what I've seen coming in, we do a lot of IRB review of student work, graduate student work typically, and some undergraduate as well. They all have to get IRB certification. And some of the things that come in are truly hair-raising. They are just, don't do that, and you have to say, no, you cannot interview someone who is applying for unemployment in the unemployment line, being overheard by other people and asking them highly intimate personal questions. You just can't do that. And here's all the reasons why. And this is part of the research learning process for the students themselves. But it's very fortunate that we do have that back and forth available to us. But I do think it's a really important function of the IRB to have somebody who's just, their whole job is to really think on the side of the person who's having this happen to them. And I'd love to hear your experiences too.
Oh my gosh, it's been interesting. But like you said, I think the best part about it was, as a graduate student, it was a very important learning experience for me to have that person there, that oversight board, to make sure that I was doing everything correctly, even outside of what my professor was doing. So, well, thank you very much. I think, do we have one more question before we move forward?
Another question or comment from the people in the auditorium here. But when Patricia has been talking, something popped up in my mind. She's mentioned that when you are collecting data, maybe interviews from people, you should not ask them too personal questions where everybody's hearing what you're asking. And whereas I agree with that, it has just occurred to me, like when we go to the embassies for visa interview, actually you are put on microphone and you are asked, where are you going? Why are you going there? How long? Have you brought the bank statement? So everybody hears. Sometimes those questions are very embarrassing. And I'm not just asking Patricia, but I'm asking even our regulators here. Is there a way in which the embassies, for example, can be regulated in terms of how they collect data from people? Because even when you are denied a visa, you are denied in public, where everybody hears that you have not qualified to get the visa. So when you mentioned asking personal questions in a public forum, that's when it struck me, and I thought I just mentioned that. Meanwhile, any other question or comment? Yes, okay. Great, back to you, Kyser, please.
All right, thank you very much. I would next like to introduce Dr. Lyombe Echo. He is a professor of journalism and creative media industries at the Texas Tech University College of Media and Communication. He was an adjunct lecturer at Daystar University in the 1990s. And has also been a professor at the University of Maine and the University of Iowa in the United States. He researches comparative and international communication law and ethics, new media law and policy, collective memory, and visual communication. He obtained his PhD from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale in the United States. Go Salukis. Dr. Echo has written several books, including The Charlie Hebdo Affair and Comparative Journalistic Cultures, Human Rights versus Religious Rights, The Regulation of Sex-Themed Visual Imagery from Clay Tablets to Tablet Computers, American Exceptionalism, the French Exception and Digital Media Law, and New Media, Old Regimes, Case Studies in Comparative Communication Law and Policy. He has served as a journalist at Cameroon Radio and Television Corporation, and he has also worked as a student media advisor and a documentary producer, translator, and editor. Today, Dr. Echo will present To Show or Not to Show Controversial Images in Visual Communication Research. He will address the vicissitudes of visual communication research in a globalized environment where visual media laws, cultures, and ethics collide. In the last decade, the world has witnessed a slew of controversies over visual images. These have ranged from manipulated images to the Muhammad cartoons, and from visual stereotypes to ISIS beheadings of journalists. In this presentation, Professor Echo will focus on the ethics of controversial images in visual communication research. Dr. Echo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here, glad to be with my friends and colleagues in Daystar. Can you see my PowerPoint there?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Excellent. So what I'm going to do, I need to say, Professor Aufderheide, thank you very much for a very comprehensive and informative presentation, which really, I think, touches all the bases, to use an American metaphor. And it's very comprehensive. It covers almost everything. So what I'm going to do today, I'm not going to go into a lot of how-tos and a lot of theory, ethical theory. What I want to do is tell you a couple of stories about how I have encountered the problem of visual ethics, particularly controversial ethics. So just a case study from the trenches that I'm going to present to you. I start with the German proverb, experience is the best teacher. So this is from experience. So let me start with that controversy. Number one, case study number one, the Yelan Mohammed cartoons affair that took place in 2005. You see, in my area of research, I do comparative communication. And so this controversy was very interesting to me as a researcher. You see on the left side of your screen there, that was the page of the newspaper from Jyllands-Posten from Denmark. They published 12 cartoons of Prophet Muhammad. And the most controversial was probably this one, where Muhammad is wearing a turban, which is a bomb. And on his face, you see on his turban is the Islamic faith creed. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. So it was directly a provocative and incendiary cartoon. And so how did this come about? There's a Danish children's book writer who wanted to write a book about Muhammad for the Danish schools. They wanted to teach the Danish children to appreciate Islam as a religion. So what he did is he wrote a book narrating the life of Muhammad. The problem is that he couldn't get an illustrator. You know, a children's book needs illustrations. He couldn't get one. And because all the cartoonists and the illustrations in Denmark said, well, you know, that there's a fatwa, there's a prohibition in Islam against publishing the image of Muhammad. So we don't want to go there. So this man was, he was stranded. He had text, no images. And then something happened in the law school in Denmark, in Aarhus. A professor went and he read from the Quran and he critiqued a part of Islamic law, and he was attacked. And then someone else wanted to have an exhibition on Islam in a museum in Denmark, and the person was kind of shouted down. So this newspaper, the largest circulation newspaper, Jyllands-Posten, said, hey, this is Denmark. We have a freedom of speech and expression. We should be able to publish anything we want. So they invited all the cartoonists in Denmark to publish cartoons of Muhammad, and that was the result. Needless to say, the cartoons shook the world, so to speak, to quote a book written by Professor Clausen, who is at Tufts University in Massachusetts. We had demonstrations and attacks all over the world. And people who tried to publish those images on Facebook, they were banned, etc., etc., etc. So very soon, a colleague of mine, Dan Berkovitz, came up to me and said, this is an interesting area. Why don't we do a study on this subject? I said, okay, let's do it. So we published an article in Journalism Studies. That's the title of the article. The problem with this article is that this journal is published in the United Kingdom. And they were not quite interested in publishing those cartoons. So here we are, my friend and I, my colleague and I from the University of Iowa. I was at the University of Iowa at that time. And we had written this article about cartoons. And the journal said they were not going to publish the cartoons. They were worried that they might have riots in the streets in the UK and so on. So they were using their editorial independence, so to speak, to decide to publish or not to publish. So it was a comparative study of American and French journalistic cultures. My colleague studied the New York Times. What had the New York Times handled this? Because the American media were generally very solicitous towards the Islamic religion. At that time, very few, not only maybe the University of Illinois newspaper and the Philadelphia Inquirer, those are the only two newspapers in America that reproduced those Muhammad cartoons, even though they were, really, really newsworthy. They made news around the world. So the American newspapers generally, and the media generally were very, very, they didn't want to, fan the flames, so to speak. So they did not publish those cartoons. So we had this study. My friend studied the American media, which was, really, really, really quiet about it. And the French, and I studied the French media, which was very militant about it. The French media were, they were really, really, they were insulting the American media. You guys have a First Amendment and you're cowards. You can publish this. So what's your First Amendment good for? Et cetera, et cetera. So it was an interesting study. The problem with that study is that Taylor and Francis was not eager to publish that thing. And then they were kind of rushing us to go to press. So we said, was it ethical? Is it ethical? Is it right for us to publish an article about a controversy without showing the subject of the controversy? But anyway, my colleague and I, we had a divided opinion. The end result is that we published that article without the cartoons. And I was a little bit disturbed about that. And so we didn't do IRB because this was a textual and a visual analysis, even though we didn't do a visual analysis per se. We described the pictures, we didn't show them. That was a problem there for us. So we didn't do the IRB. We said, okay, this is just a textual analysis, a visual analysis, no human subjects are involved. So that was the first thing we did. The ethical issue is we did not reproduce the subject of the article. Was it ethical? Were we doing the right thing to our audiences, to the future generations? So we did. So I said, okay, how about study number 2? This time I said, okay, I will do an ethnographic study of newsroom routines. I will study the editors. A number of editors around the world decided to publish these cartoons. So I said, okay, the question was, why did you publish the cartoons? Did you, like the British media generally said, we use our editorial independence. And the French would say, we published it in defense of freedom of speech and expression, etc. So we were, at that time, my colleague and I were no longer doing research. So I decided to do this particular research alone. And so you see the picture there, that's the editor of Fleming Rose, that's the editor of the culture editor of Yealand's Post, and who took the ultimate decision to publish those 12 Danish cartoons. And he had death sentence. He had ultimately he lost his job as the editor, and he took refuge in the United States. Actually, the Danish police said they could not guarantee his safety, so he came to the United States and he became a scholar at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, and he published that book, The Tyranny of Silence, about what happened to him. So I still, I wanted to do a study that would be both a quantitative study and a qualitative newsroom observation in Paris. I was really, really interested in seeing how these journalists, the editors, arrived at the decision to publish these cartoons, even though they are so controversial. That was what I wanted to, and so I wanted to go to Paris and talk to these people and see how they do and observe them. So I applied for an IRB. You see, now I'm talking to human beings. And so I said, okay, I sent my application up. They asked me to send them the survey, the questionnaire. Send us the protocol, let's take a look. This was at the University of Iowa. I sent it up. There was no personal questions. It was all about how did you arrive at this decision? Did you follow the First Amendment? Did you follow the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the French equivalent of the First Amendment? Was it editorial independence? Well, with just those kinds of technical questions. So the IRB came back to me and they said, your questions do not involve any personal, there's no personal information there, so you are exempt. The only issue here is that in this kind of controversial issue, there really is no separation between the personal and the professional, because ultimately I discovered that a lot of the editors, when I sent out that questionnaire, a lot of the editors had been arrested in Yemen, in Algeria, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan. A lot of the editors were already in trouble. So I got less than 5% response. A lot of them were in jail. A lot of them had quit their job, like a Fleming Rose here, and they were fired, they left. So I discovered that, I got those about 5 responses or 5% responses. I said, I don't think this is worth going forward with, because if they had responded to the questions, it might lead to them getting into further trouble, because already I couldn't reach some of them because they were already in jail or they were under legal jeopardy. So I decided that the survey aspect of the thing is not the ethical thing to do. So I dropped it. I put it on hold. I said, I'm not going to do it. The only thing I had from these editors were the statements they made in court, because the editors of Charlie Hebdo were sued in France, they were sued in Denmark, they were sued in Yemen, they were sued in a number of countries. So they had to say in open court what they, so I had those statements to go by. So I decided to change the nature of my study. Since I also studied media law, I said, okay, I will look at the legal aspect of this. So I don't have to deal with this survey, but I still had it at the back of my mind that I wanted to go to Charlie Hebdo to study them. So I did a study of the legal aspects of this because of the cases that had happened. I started looking at court decisions in Denmark and France and Canada and Turkey. The most interesting for me was what happened in Denmark. So I wanted to, first of all, get the legal documents from Denmark. I wrote to the Danish Ministry of Justice. They have a website. I got the address. And they sent an email back to me. They said, what is your interest in the case? I said, I'm a researcher. I gave them my university credentials and so on. That's all. I'm doing an analysis. And they told me, they said, in Denmark, court decisions are not public documents. They are made available only to the parties concerned. So for you to get that, the decision of the court, and by the way, the court had said that that newspaper had not violated the right of freedom of speech and expression, because you see, the Muslim community had sued that newspaper in Denmark, claiming that those cartoons were hate speech directed at Muslims, and the court disagreed. But there was a court decision I needed to quote from. So the Danish Ministry of Justice said, okay, we'll hand you over, send this thing to the court and see what they decide. So I got a message from the registrar of the court, said, okay, we will make an exception. Since you're a researcher, we'll give you the document. You will just pay us 30 Danish kroner. I said, okay, sure, fine. I went to my bank. I got a cashier's check. It wasn't. I looked at it. Right. I sent them, because my bank in Iowa doesn't deal with Danish kroner, so I sent them a money order in dollars. And 2 weeks later, I received a big envelope in my mailbox. I opened it. At the top, they sent me back my check, and they sent me the court decision from the court in Denmark, but it was in perfect Danish. And I said, oops, what am I going to do with this? I don't read Danish, so what am I going to do with this? So the good thing is, if you have contacts in the university, I talked to our administrative assistant, who they have a meeting of all administrative assistants in all the departments in the university. So she put that message on their little discussion group. And one administrative assistant, oh yeah, we have a Fulbright student who studied in Denmark. Maybe that student will help you out. So they put me in contact with that student. I found the student, who happened to be, interestingly, a Texan who had gone to as a Fulbright to Denmark to translate Danish poems into English. So I talked to the guy. The guy says, I'm not a legal scholar. I do poems and literary works, but I can give you a rough idea. So that student, for a little stipend from the department, was able to translate the document for me. So I wrote the case with that. Now, so I decided I was going to put that in as a chapter in this book. I was writing this book on comparative communication law and policy. So I said I will put the Jyllands-Posten, or compare how the French and the Danish courts handled this case. So I was going to put that case as a chapter in this book, that comparative study. The problem is, when I wanted to publish, again, the subject, that Jyllands-Posten, from that newspaper, that page, was a full-page newspaper of those 12 cartoons. My publisher said, my publisher is from Lanham, Maryland, Roman and Littlefield. They were a little bit leery. So you know what? They tried to create a roadblock. They accepted the manuscript. The peer review was good. And then they said, well, we need a copyright clearance from all the owners of these cartoons you want to publish. So I went back to the Jyllands-Posten. That's the ethical thing to do. You know, you don't publish people's stuff without their consent. So I went to the newspaper. The newspaper said, okay, you know, we have the copyright to that one page. We give it to you, but we do not have the copyright to the individual cartoons. So you need to get clearance from those individual cartoons. There are 12 of them. And beware that they all have a fatwa on their heads. They have a death sentence on their heads, and a lot of them are in hiding. So try to get them if you can. That's what they were telling me. So in other words, they were telling me, you can't publish those cartoons. So again, I was confronted with that same issue we had in that first article we published. Is it right for the historical record to publish a chapter about the court cases in France and Denmark without publishing the subject of the case? So I decided I was not going to do it. So I decided to try to get the lawyer for Fleming Rose, that editor, and the lawyer for Yelan's Post in the newspaper. I asked the newspaper, could you give me the lawyer, please, so I can have access to him and I can talk to him. So they were a little bit reluctant. They sent me a long letter in Danish. So fortunately for me at that time, I had met a colleague who happens to be Danish in the Department of Religious Studies. He helped me with the translation. And we got that, he told me, essentially, they are going to try to get you the lawyer and see what can happen. So a couple of days later, I got an email. Somebody says, send an email to this group. That email was the Danish Cartoonist Association. So that lawyer was able to get the association for me. And so I sent the email to that association. And the first response I got was from this guy, Kurt Vestergaard. He has a death sentence on his head. He is the guy who drew the cartoon of Mohammed with the turban, which is a bomb. That's the guy. He was in hiding because he had been attacked. It was an interesting case. He was babysitting his granddaughter, and his granddaughter was sleeping upstairs. He was in the living room downstairs, and he had built some kind of a bunker in the basement just in case he got attacked. And before he knew it, he got attacked. So he quickly rushed into the bunker downstairs, called the police, and his little daughter was upstairs. And those people, the killers, burst into his house, into his living room. He was not there. And they looked for him, and then the police came quickly because the police had his house under surveillance, and they arrested the assailants. And then Westergaard came out, and guess what? He says, my granddaughter slept through the whole thing. The little girl did not even know what happened. So ultimately, he sent me, he says, I give you permission to reproduce my cartoons. And then the rest of them sent me emails. So they had discussed it at the Danish Cartoonist Union. And they said, okay, this is for the sake of the record, we will give him permission. So they gave me the permission to publish those 12 cartoons. So I did indeed publish them in this book, which you see here. So, so what happened then, this is Kurt Vestergaard here. He was, and then he told me, he said, send me an email. He says, you have the permission to use that cartoon, but send me a copy of the book. So when the book was published, I sent him a copy, but I tried to say, okay, Mr. Westergaard, I've sent you the copy. The email bounced back to me. He had changed it because for security reasons. Anyway, so that's my first, my second story with that. So I decided, I said, again, remember I had this idea of going to Charlie Hebdo to look and observe this. I was very curious because the French, my dealings with the French were very interesting. I sent an email to, this was the editor, Charlie, Stéphane Charbonnier, that was his name. He was one of the 12 who was killed. I sent an email to Le Monde, which had reproduced some Mohammed cartoons and created its own. And I was very, you see, I discovered that with the French, if you're doing research, if you want any permission for anything, as long as you write it in perfect French, you get it. So I happen to be bilingual. I'm from Cameroon, so we grew up speaking both French and English. So I wrote emails to all of these people in French, and they got back to me. I was surprised. Le Monde sent me a copy of the cartoon, says, go ahead. And then Charbonnier, this editor, he gave me, he says, go ahead and use the cartoons, Charlie Hebdo cartoons. So I used them. This is him here. His office was firebombed. That's the first incident. And that's him showing call it the Black Power salute. That's him, Charbonnier. And then that's 2011. My book came out in 2012. that book had just, so I got the permission. Getting permission from the French was easy. Now, we had this Charlie Hebdo massacre, January 5, 2015. And remember, I had been planning to go to Paris, to that newsroom. We woke up on January 5, 2015, with the news that that newsroom had been attacked, and 12 of the journalists and editors and cartoonists had been killed, including Charbonnier, whom I had been communicating with. That's the person whom I was hoping, that was my contact for my ethnographic study I was planning to do. And Charbonnier was dead. I was really stunned, because all of a sudden, news went around that I studied Charlie Hebdo. I got calls from the radio station. I got a call from the TV station. They wanted interviews. And, some people around me said, hey, do you want to do that? You are going to be in danger. And I said, I have an ethical responsibility. Charbonnier is dead. He gave me, I've been talking to him. We communicated. And now I have a duty to set the record straight, because nobody wants to. So I decided to write this book here, The Charlie Hebdo Affair. So that was the end of my ethnographic study. The Charlie Hebdo newsroom existed no more. It has been attacked, and it was a crime scene, and that was the end of the story. So I decided to change the direction of that study I was going to do. It was no longer an ethnographic study. It now became a textual and visual analysis of how different journalistic traditions around the world viewed that Charlie Hebdo affair. And so I studied Canada. The French press in Canada is different from the English press. In Canada, the French press were very militant, just like the French. There's a cultural continuity between France and Quebec. So they published all the cartoons over there. The English language press in Canada did not publish those cartoons. In the United States, there was a division. The New York Times refused to publish any of the cartoons for security reasons. So did CNN. But the Washington Post became a champion of freedom of speech and expression. They published those cartoons and a number of other newspapers. So I studied the United States and Canada. And then I went down to Mexico. The Mexicans were very, very shocked by this event, because you see, Mexico has the highest number of murdered journalists in the world, because the cartels, the drug cartels, kill journalists at random with impunity. The journalists who write about things going on in Mexico, I'm here in Texas, just across the border from us here, they get killed. So the Mexican newspapers took this personal. For them, it was like it was a hit on them. So I did one chapter on Mexico and then one chapter on Brazil, where we also have a problem, and a chapter on Ecuador. So that was the Latin American side. And then I did Africa. It will interest you. I did 3 countries in Africa, how they've approached this issue. I studied Senegal, Kenya, and South Africa, how the media approach. And there was the South African newspaper, the South African journalist, Zapiro, cartoonist. He published a very interesting cartoon which went global. And then besides South Africa, I did India. India was a very interesting case, because there was a newspaper there, which was headed by a lady, an Urdu newspaper. She published the story of the cartoons, and she said the Pope, she was a Muslim herself. She says the Pope had condemned the publication of those cartoons. And so she used an illustration of one of those cartoons that a French newspaper had published back in 2005 to show how, how horrible, how insensitive the Western press, especially the French press, was. And guess what? That editor got arrested. the rest of our staff turned on her because she was the only female editor. It became a gender issue. They turned on her, turned her to the police. She was arrested and charged. She was fired. Her newspaper was closed. So I looked at that from an Indian context, and then I went to Turkey and then Europe and so on. So this is what this book is all about. In the meantime, the Charlie Hebdo, after the shooting, they published another Mohammed cartoon, which inflamed the situation further. And there was this Je suis Charlie rallies and so on in Paris. And then we had Charbonnier. He had, incidentally, one day before the massacre, before he was killed with all the others, he had sent a manuscript of why they published. And this is it here, on blasphemy, Islamophobia, and the true enemies of freedom of expression. And his pen name was Sharp. He's the editor, but he's also a cartoonist. He released that. He sent the manuscript to his editor one day, and then the next day he was killed. So that book came out, and it gave us a lot of information about the insights I could have gotten, I was looking for if I had gone to his newsroom. So I would say he did posterity a favor by writing that book before he was killed. And then, of course, Fleming Rose had also written a book. So we got a fairly good amount of information on those two editors at least. The other editors, most of them were silent because it's dangerous to talk, especially if the whole world is bearing down on you. And so I think I'm going to end there. I just wanted to give those examples to show that those ethical issues are very complex. Sometimes the line between the professional and the personal, which I thought existed when I was going into this study, I said, well, I'm just going to do a survey. There's nothing personal about it. It's just about journalistic routines. But here, journalistic routines lead to personal danger, to the death of these people. So the line between the personal and the professional was blurred in this case. And we learned many things that, first of all, I think we owe a duty. I owe the duty to these people, my subjects, an ethical duty to Charbonnier, Gérard Charbonnier, whom I was talking to in Charlie Hebdo. I had to tell his story, at least from my perspective, and how the rest of the world was reacting to his story. And I believe that we need to be ethical. We have to, if we are telling the story of what happened, we need to present all the evidence. Because today we are in 2021. I go to class, I mentioned the Charlie Hebdo. A lot of students today have never heard of it. They don't know about it. You see, the record they have is what is written in the newspapers. You know, the newspapers are supposed to be a rough draft of history. And if that draft, if you look at the Washington Post, you will get a good picture of that controversy. If you look at the New York Times, you won't. That's the point I was making in this book. I will leave it there and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lyombe. We appreciate it. While we get set up for questions, I do want to very quickly introduce our International Communication Association, which is the sponsor of this panel. And so I just want to briefly introduce the association and our division for those of you who might be interested. The International Communication Association is for anyone interested in the study, teaching, and application of all aspects of human and mediated communication worldwide. So please look for us at icahdq.org if you are interested in joining. Specifically, we all represent the Visual Communication Studies Division. So we take all of that and look at it from the visual perspective, as you have seen from both of our excellent presenters today. We will be hosting a conference in Paris in 2022. The deadline for abstracts is coming up in early November. You can find out more information also on Twitter if you want to follow us at ICA VizCom. You'll see lots of information about upcoming calls for papers, upcoming calls for conference presentations, etc. And I also want to specifically highlight our internationalization efforts. The leadership team has tried really hard to expand our reach because in November of 2019, we realized that we were not doing the world a service. We were mainly 94% coming from North America, Europe, and Asia. And so we've been doing what we can to reach out to other parts of the world, make sure that we truly are the International Communication Association and not just looking at specific areas. So I encourage you to explore what we have to offer in the International Communication Association, as well as within the visual communication studies. You've met, again, two of our wonderful scholars today. There are many more out there that are studying lots of interesting things as it relates to visual communication. So let me end sharing so we can get to our questions. Let's see. All right. If you want to type your questions in the chat, you can go ahead. And those of you who are in person, please approach the podium and we'll get your question answered.
That very insightful presentation and sharing. It has been very interesting. We have learned quite a bit. So let me ask the people here in Nairobi in the auditorium, is there anyone with a question or with a comment? Yes, Prof. So there is one coming your way.
Thank you very much, Professor Lyombe, for that beautiful presentation. My question is, I've followed your presentation very keenly, and I would like to know from your perspective whether cartoons that are used to castigate individuals, either within the context of publication or wherever, how ethical is it? Yeah, or do cartoonists who do the cartoons consult or ask for consent from the individuals whose images are to be imitated in a cartoon? And if so, if it is not, as is there any redress for any potential damage as a result of that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question. Freedom of speech in democratic countries, including Kenya, include what we call regular speech, oral speech, and symbolic speech, and expressive conduct. And that also includes parody. Parody, the legal definition of parody is a mocking imitation of an existing work or an existing person for purposes of criticism. In this case, a person who is cartooned, generally they're people who are public officials and public figures. They are people who decide the fate of nations and other peoples. And so they are open in democratic societies to criticism. That's why cartoons are a form of, they're a shortcut, so to speak. Cartoonists pack into one drawing what a writer would put in 10 pages. It's a shorthand. So cartoonists have the right of freedom of expression, and they do use it to draw images, critical images. The test is that person a public person? Is it a public official? Is it a public figure? Is it done in the political context? Is it a personal? If it's a personal and it's something that's driven by personal animosity, that is problematic. But if it is something that is done in a political context, in a political discussion, in most countries around the world, that is protected by the laws of freedom of speech and expression. So people who are cartooned, and cartoons are parodies and caricatures, those cartoons are protected speech under the First Amendment. In the United States, they're protected under clauses that protect freedom of speech and expression in virtually every country in the world that is democratic. It's in autocratic countries where cartoons are not allowed, cartoons of the leaders. I know, I lived in Kenya for 9 years. It was, you could not cartoonists could not cartoon Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, for example. It was only after the reforms in Kenya that we had a Gado cartoon of Mzee Moi, Daniel Arap Moi, because when we had more freedom of speech and expression in Kenya, then cartoonists bloomed. So cartoonists and cartoons are a barometer, a measure of freedom of speech and expression in any given country. A country that does not have cartoons of the political leaders, I'm talking the political leaders who make decisions and that affect the lives of millions of citizens, those people are under, there's an obligation for them to be examined, and cartoonists examine those politicians in their own way. So to the best of my knowledge, I don't know any person who has sued a cartoonist and said, you know, I don't like this cartoon of me, and so I sue you in court. I need so much money as a redress. Yeah, I don't know anywhere in Africa, at least. I know in Africa, in many countries, they arrest the cartoonist. I know that in Cameroon, for example, where I came from, the cartoonist drew images of the president and his wife, and they were not very flattering cartoonists. And some political thugs from the security services visited the cartoonist. They visited him. I wrote about that in one of my articles. They visited him at night, but he had been tipped off and he was not home. But they left a message with his wife and children. They said, you must be nice to the president. If you are not nice to the president, you will face death by panga, machete, death by 1,000 cuts. They left him the message and he fled. The guy, he ran away from the country. He went to South Africa. And there was a big hue and cry. And then he ultimately, when things kind of died down, he came back. But he learned this lesson. That is a country that is not democratic. In democratic countries, political leaders know that being cartooned comes with a territory of being a public official, of being a public figure who has power, who has influence, and so on and so forth. Thank you. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. I'm curious as we wait for any further questions. You know, what is it about the nature of visuals that maybe makes this so much more of an issue than maybe, say, if you would ask the journal to reprint some words that had been written, even if they were parody? Is there a difference between the visual and the written word that makes this so much more of a concern for journals or for people? And what is it about that?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Psychologists have shown that, you know, written words, when we read them, we process them analytically through our brains and so on and so forth. Pictures, visual images, cartoons take a shortcut into our emotions, and they hit us at the visceral. You know, we have a visceral reaction, and those studies have shown that. And in many African countries, where a lot of people, they don't read the newspapers, but they can see the picture. They say, oops, that looks like the president. And so it registers pretty quickly. And so I know for a country like Congo, they don't care about what the reporters write sometimes. But the cartoon that accompanies the article, it's a no-no. They tell them, remove the cartoon, leave the article as it is. Because again, visuals, we as visual communicators know that visuals have a way of reaching people. We've heard the expression, one picture is worth 1,000 words, and it's even more so now in that we have this, we're in a multimedia, converged media environment. Pictures are very, very effective in communicating messages and going around our analytical structures, which we try to think. A picture registers a punch pretty quickly, better than anything else. That's why a lot of dictators do not like cartoons. It's one thing they will tolerate anything, but not a cartoon, a caricature of the president in a humiliating position. That's unacceptable. That's the problem.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, let's go to the podium.
Very much, Professor Lyombe, and thank you to Kyser for moderating this session. There are more questions from here in Nairobi and also probably on the chat, but with your permission, I would like you, the moderator, to probably make your final remarks and comments so that we have one of us from here in Nairobi to move a vote of thanks. And if you allow us, we can continue the sharing and discussions online, probably via the emails, or we can tag to ICA. So I request, Kyser, that you take over and make your final remarks, and then I will invite one of the delegates here in Nairobi to move a vote of thanks from our end. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your attention today. Thank you to both of our presenters for their wonderful and informative presentations. I highly encourage you to reach out to both of them with your additional questions, to consider joining the International Communication Association, specifically the Visual Communication Studies Division, if you do any type of communication research, including especially visual-oriented research. I would love to speak with you about it at any point. I wish I could be there in person. I hope to be there in person next year. I think this is a wonderful conference and hope it's provided you many opportunities. Thank you again for your attention and look forward to seeing you again.
As I invite Professor Gordon Nguka to come and move a vote of thanks, could you kindly have the contacts, if they don't mind, of the two presenters and probably yours on the chat so that delegates can continue to contact them. So from me, thank you for honoring the invitation and for waking up so early, all of you, to share with us on this other part of the globe. So Professor Gordon, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, the organizers. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our presenters abroad. Dr. Kyser, it has been very nice to see you do this organization. Technology has brought us closer, and we are just in a global village. Despite the fact that you woke up very early in the morning, you had the energy to take us through. Professor Patricia, it was a grateful, very wonderful presentation, and we are grateful to have learned a lot from you. Professor Lyombe, that was an interesting presentation on this issue of visual and how to deal with it, but I've heard your response. And also, Dr. Thomson in absentia, it was great putting up this together, and we're very happy for what has happened this evening. For that matter, I would like to present, I have 4 souvenirs from Kenya. I hope you are receiving it virtually. Dr. Kyser, are you still on board?
I'm here.
Souvenir here from the land of Masai Mara, Kenya. I have 4 of them. Are you able to see? This is
Yes.
what we are going to do. It's a bait for you to come to Nairobi. So we are going to keep it, and Professor here is going to make sure that when you arrive, then this is your souvenir. The 4 of you, each one of you will have one of these. You can take an evidence so that you can be able to ask exactly what it was. I think you're able to see the branding. Thank you very much, and we appreciate you. Have a nice morning as we have a nice evening this side.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I have my passport ready.